well, here's the background information. They're persistent in the Amazon. Well, as you know, a lot of magic which goes on in the Amazon has to do with the sending of a magical object into the body of an enemy or a person who is made sick, and then the shamans suck these objects out. And invariably, if you are a particularly positivist chucklehead, the question arises for you, is it real? Meaning, can we put it on display in a museum? And then the shamans say yes and no, and sometimes, depending on who you're talking to and probably how much aguardiente they have moving through them at the moment, persistent is the idea that these ayahuasqueros vomit or produce out of their bodies some kind of substance, a magical substance that is the basis of their witchcraft. And, your attitude toward this can be that it's sleight of hand, or that it's lying, or that it's absolutely true. In my talk yesterday, I said, we give great respect to these shaman. How seriously do we take their claim to do all their magic via helping spirits who are ancestors? And then we sort of explored that. Well, we give these shamans great respect. How seriously then are we obligated, or should we take the claim that they do all of their magic by the production of a magical fluid out of their mouths and bodies, a fluid whose ontological status is far from clear? That's what I mean by you can't tell whether it's real or not. Dennis, in 1970, came across a reference to this in some piece of literature. I confess that I have occasionally cited it as Michael Harner's article, The Sound of Rushing Water, which appeared in Natural History magazine in 1967. Just to confirm Marlene's opinion, if you actually read that article, you will discover there is no reference to this in there. I couldn't find a reference in the literature until years after our investigation of the phenomenon was pretty much wrapped up. I was amazed to discover that our supposition that such a thing existed actually is supported in the literature. Luis Eduardo Luna, who some of you may know, and most of you probably know his book on ayahuasca painting, has talked about this in numerous of his more scholarly publications. What is claimed is that there are among very unacculturated people a habit, when intoxicated on ayahuasca, of vomiting a material, and then what's said of it is that it's blue, that the shamans use it to accomplish all their magic, and that when you spread it out on the bottom of a flat bowl, that you can see the future in it, or the past in it. Well, if we just behave like good phenomenologists and don't try to scientifically analyze this, but phenomenologically analyze it, then we have to say what is being described is a form of matter which also partakes of the quality of mind. It appears to be something which is both physical and spiritual, both substantial and psychic or psychological in some sense. And one of our motivations, I told you the story about going to La Chorrera and the search for Ukuhe, but one of our motivations was to investigate this magical material and to see if we could encounter it. Sparrow is the only person I've ever met who claims to have seen something blue come out of someone's mouth on an ayahuasca trip and to be pushed back in. Some of you were there when he made the reference. You saw that I pulled no strings and in fact said nothing to prompt it. So I regard it as uncontaminated information from a deep forest informant. So what is it? Is a reasonable question for curious people to ask. Dennis, who tends these days to rein himself in somewhat, back in the early 70s was always willing to run the speculative engine at double speed, and he felt that, he had a concept, and the concept was that it's an interlocking set of hypotheses, none of which have ever been secured, and I have to background it a little bit. As you know, it is a great mystery in neurophysiology, the mystery of memory and how it works and where are the memories is a question that has never been answered. The problem for materialists is that it's well understood that every molecule in your body is changed in about a 5 to 9 year period. You are not who you were 10 years ago. Every atom, every molecule in your body has been swapped out with one significant exception, which is the neural substrate, the neural matrix. What you're born with is what you die with. So the memory, if you believe in a physical site of storage, and all scientists do because there is no other medium open for a scientist to believe in, then it must be stored in the neural matrix. Well, so then you try to create a hypothesis of a mechanism for this memory storage and recovery. Now, this raises another complex issue, which is, and I'm moving at lightning speed here, the issue of the nature of information in biological systems. As you all know, organic organisms are created and maintained by DNA. And I assume everybody understands how DNA works. I mean, it's just something you learn in high school biology courses. DNA is a very complex, superhelixed molecule that is essentially two structural members which are twining around each other like a liana, and then they are connected across by nucleotides. And these nucleotides, in groups of 3, are what are called codons, and they code for amino acids. This is, it's an important but subtle distinction that they code for the amino acids. In other words, there is nothing in principle that links a certain codon in chemistry to a certain amino acid. It is simply a conventionalized association that has apparently come into existence over millions and millions of years of evolution, so that adenine, guanine, adenine codes for something, and so forth and so on. In other words, there is a symbolic representation of the amino acids in the codons of DNA. Well, memory is also information, but it's a different kind of information. It's what's called epigenetic information. And if you were to take what I'm saying and about to say to an orthodox molecular biologist, he would very condescendingly explain to you that you had made an amateurish mistake and had confused genetic information, the information which codes for proteins, with epigenetic information, symphonies, novels, works of philosophy, conversations, so forth and so on. And but this same condescending neuromolecular biologist is totally unable to account for the phenomenon of memory. Well, noticing that nature functions always with a certain economy when that's possible, it seems like a reasonable first hypothesis would be that memory is coded somehow into the DNA. And giving a slight aid and comfort to this idea is the well-known fact that there are vast portions of the DNA molecule that are called the nonsense portions. In other words, they do not code for protein. No one knows what these vast stretches of DNA are for, and the orthodox explanation is that they are just errors, trash, basically, that has accumulated in the evolutionary process. Nevertheless, the mystery of memory is left unexplained. How are the memory traces laid down, and how are they recalled? Well, Dennis's notion in trying to think about what the psychedelic experience is was that perhaps psychedelic molecules have a relationship to the DNA that has not been elucidated by science. And in his favor is the fact that many of these psychedelic molecules, especially the ones most near and dear to us, such as psilocybin, harmine, harmaline, DMT, are what are called planar molecules. In other words, if we could explode a molecule of harmine up to the size of a bathtub, what we would have is a flat structure. The two benzene rings associated with the pentexyl group in the middle, and it is of the correct dimension, coincidentally enough, that a harmine molecule could in fact fit into a DNA molecule between the nucleotide pairs without disrupting the structure of the DNA. This is a studied phenomenon. Molecules which, the word is intercalate, molecules which can slip in between the DNA pairs, the nucleotide pairs, are called intercalators or dimers. And most of them are highly toxic because in the process of slipping in there, they distort the helical structure of the molecule. In other words, they kink it up. A molecule that some of us have experience with that I believe works this way is chloroquine. Chloroquine, this is why I say, it's a heavy drug. It messes with your genetic machinery. It's actually getting in there. And usually these molecules are used in vitro work with DNA because they can be used as markers. You can take a radioactive dimer and it will intercalate into DNA, and then you can perform certain operations and measurements. But it was shown in, I believe, 1966 by the chemists Yielding and Sturglantz that psychedelic molecules do intercalate into DNA in vitro. in the test tube in a series of very elegant experiments in which what they did is they took denatured DNA, unfolded from its superstructure, but still helix DNA, and they put it in test tubes with various drug molecules, and they shook it up, and then they measured the specific gravity of the molecular complex that resulted, and they showed that the specific gravity had increased by a number which was always divisible by the molecular weight of the drug molecule. This is pretty elegant demonstration that the drug molecule has in fact intercalated into the DNA. Now, against this, at that time, we're talking now the early 70s, was a near dogma of neurophysiology, which said movement of materials in the neuron, which is what a nerve cell is called, movement of materials in the neuron is from the nucleus to the synapse. You all recall that the synapse is where these drug molecules do their work because there are lock and key relationships, and they shift the, well, it's not known, either the steric configuration or the electrical activity of the synapse. And so when we would talk to orthodox molecular biologists about this, they would say, well, there is no known mechanism of transport from the synapse to the neuron, to the nucleus of the neuron. And if you're hypothesizing that memory is somehow stored in the DNA, then somehow experiences which affect the synapse have to, there has to be some conveyance of this change of state at the synaptic cleft back to the nucleus in the neuron. And these nerve cells are very elongated structures. The axon is can be several millimeters in length. In some cases, like in the squid axon, it's quite large, over a centimeter, I think. Anyway, now giving aid and comfort to our side is the fact that in the early 80s, 10 years after the experiment at La Chorrera, a new intracellular process was discovered called axioplasmic transport. And it was discovered that, in fact, molecular species generated in the synaptic cleft do turn up associated with the nucleus of the molecule, of the neuron. So, okay, this all lays the basis for his notion, which was that somehow psychedelic molecules which normally operate in the synaptic cleft can be conveyed into the nucleus of the neuron and there intercalate, and somehow this is the basis for a mechanism of modifying the silent portions of the DNA and information, not of the genetic sort, but of a transient and epigenetic sort, because your memories die with you, although Jungians might take issue here, but let's leave that issue alone for a minute. Your memories die with you, so there was a mechanism for this to happen. So, I'm not sure. Well, give me a moment here. So one of the things that we were investigating when we went to La Chorrera, Dennis believed that the importance of chanting in this Amazonian shamanism was that acoustical sound was being used as a driver to synergize this process of intercalation. And it has been demonstrated in the laboratory that you can use acoustical energy to cause the intercalation of dimers into DNA. So shortly after we arrived at La Chorrera, he created a very elaborate theory, which is described in excruciating detail in The Invisible Landscape, which is a very hard book to obtain, but it will be reprinted in 1994 by Harper. He constructed a very elegant experiment, which looks like part science, part magic. And the idea was that you would load your system with psychedelic molecules, and he believed that electron spin resonance, here's the connection, that electron spin resonance alteration of the DNA molecule was that there was some kind of transduction system in the cell that raised that electron spin resonance signal to the level of the higher cortical experience, which we call thought. In other words, that what thinking is our interpretation of very rapid microfine changes in the electron spin resonance of DNA molecules in the nucleus of neurons. And since there is no counter theory on the table, nobody knows what thought is. I mean, neurologists aren't even ready to begin to discuss that. His theory seemed reasonable to at least play with for a while. And he said that we could load our systems with biodynamic tryptamines, harmaline, harmine, beta-carbolines, and that if you could generate a tone that was precisely the analog of the electron spin resonance of the molecule, and if you could get the geometry of the angle of attack of the sound, basically, on the molecule exactly precise, that you could force the molecule, the drug molecule, into the DNA, and that it would shift the electron spin resonance of the DNA, and that it would permanently bond in there. Now, this seems to me at least worth exploring. Harmine is, if you look at it, it looks like an antenna. You know, it has the five-sided central structure and then the two benzene rings. It has charge transfer running around those rings. It's very architecturally suited to perform the function of a kind of a transmitter antenna. So imagine what we're doing here is we're dropping a harmine molecule down onto the DNA, which is itself giving off what is called a hyperfine ESR signature. And the harmine is amplifying that hyperfine signal, and this is being detected as a higher cortical experience, which we call the psychedelic experience. And that then what the psychedelic experience is assumed to be in this interpretation is it is the sum total of all information garnered by the species over time and stored in the silent portions of the DNA. Do you see? So what we're talking about here is a kind of mechanical, materialist, chemical approach to the amplification of the hidden portions of the DNA. And it is true that many people taking harmine in its pure form and taking ayahuasca report a hum. It's a characteristic of the intoxication. Dennis claimed that this was actually the electron spin resonance signal of the harmine. So when we got to La Chorrera, and under the inspiration of recklessly large doses of Stropharia cubensis, which we found growing in the pasture there, he decided that what we could do was we would take a trip, but that he would attempt to imitate the harmine hum, and that granted, you know, the human body is a very gross thing in comparison to the almost quantum chemical domain of the synapse and the nucleus, but that nevertheless, if you could generate the sound correctly, you would force the molecule into the neuron, and then there was another part of the theory which had to do with the idea that these psychedelic molecules are like octaves of each other. And if any of you have ever played the cello, you know that you can sound a note on the cello, and then if you still the string, you will hear what are called overtonal harmonics. It will sound in the octave above and below the octave in which the note was struck. And he felt that if again, here, I mean, I'm giving this to you at enormous speed. Superconductivity, which is normally associated with low temperatures, is in fact a low temperature phenomenon, but that's when you have populations of trillions of molecules. Really what superconductivity means is the stilling of molecular motion. And if it's absurd to speak of a single atom or a single molecule as being 275 degrees Kelvin below zero, because temperature is a phenomenon of mass populations of molecules. But he felt that you could essentially still these molecules, and one of the peculiar qualities of superconductive molecules is that they will bond to anything. They have a tremendous stickiness about them. So he thought that the human voice could be used to cancel the molecular motion of these harmine molecules, and you would only have to do it for a millisecond, even though the making of the tone might take 20 or 30 seconds. If you achieved the correct geometry, the correct tonality, the correct situation, for just a millisecond, the molecule would drop, the drug molecule would drop into superconducting configuration, it would intercalate, and it would bond permanently into the thing, into the neural DNA. And then it would begin broadcasting this amplified and expanded electron spin resonance. And that what this would be, he thought, was he felt that it would generate like an acoustical hologram of the contents of the DNA. And he thought that this is what the magical blue phlegm is. It is its peculiar ontological status of being part matter, part psyche, arises from the fact that it is an acoustical hologram generated out of the body. It's like ectoplasm or something. It's a wavering image of the sum total of the information within the DNA. It's sort of like trying to produce a television set without a television, the experience of television without a television set. Well, I thought that all of this sounded so wacky, and that there were so many untested assumptions and hypotheses linked together in this tinker toy structure. And since we had nothing better to do in the evenings, why not, was my attitude. So the experiment was performed, and Dennis went bananas for about 3 weeks, and we had all kinds of peculiar adventures. But one of the things that happened was that I, who had been the utter skeptic, if not the contemptuous skeptic of this, noticed that immediately after the experiment, I began to have funny ideas. And it was as though he just turned a switch. And what he had said would happen was that he would generate out of his body a glowing blue disc, which would be the holding mode of this, we called this process hypercarbylation. Why? I haven't the faintest idea at this distance. But the idea was essentially that you could cause your soul to become visible and to become stabilized in three-dimensional space, that it was like a tool, that you could give birth to a thing which was an artifact, and yet at the same time it was yourself. And that what human evolution and human history was pushing forward was the generation of, hey, let's be frank, the philosopher's stone. Out of the human body, you could, through a union of harmine and mind and psilocybin and intentionality, you could produce a kind of doppelganger, which would not look like a human being. It would look, in its holding mode, like this glowing blue disc. But because it is both mind and matter, it would have, the way he thought of it was as a hyperdimensional molecule. In other words, yesterday, Jonathan talked about dextro and rotary rotation of molecules, that you can rotate them to the right and to the left. Well, yes, in 3 dimensions, but we know that the universe is, some people think, 11-dimensional. So beyond dextro and levo rotation, there is also hyperdimensional rotation, or hypercarbylation. And he thought that once you did this, the continued existence of your physical body would become optional, and you would be able to operate as this thing which is essentially the imagination bound into 3-dimensional space. And he thought that these shamans producing this phlegm, that they were on the brink of something like this. Now, I grant you that this is far-fetched. If you think I don't think it's far-fetched, you don't understand where I'm coming from. But the idea was so incredibly beguiling and attractive, because what he said was, if you have this, if you can produce this ultimate tool, then you can do anything. I mean, if you want to take a shower on it, you just stretch it out and water pours out of it. If you want to go somewhere, you turn it over and sit on it and it flies. If you're hungry, you eat it. Do you get the idea? So I said, you can't be serious, Dr. McKenna, although he wasn't a doctor at the time. So this experiment was performed. He began to behave very peculiarly, and I began to have these funny ideas. And one thing which did happen, which I offer as evidence for the manipulation of some very, very peculiar effect out on the edge of intelligibility, was I didn't sleep for 11 days. And he had said this would happen. He said, you will no longer need to sleep, you will no longer excrete, you will no longer eat, because your body has become superconductive. And you are essentially, you have sealed yourself off. You have become the stuff of soul. You are no longer embedded in the world of metabolism. And what also and he had the idea that the thing would occur instantly. This blue disc would appear instantly. And of course, when the experiment was performed, nothing of the sort happened. But instead, what I began to generate were what I call, from my experience with Jungian psychology, totality symbols. A totality symbol is an idea which explains everything. It can be as simple as the syllable Om, or a mandala, or a mathematical description of reality. I mean, some totality symbols are obviously more appropriate, more effective than others. And kind of a psychotic episode, but it was a very curious psychotic episode because it took the form of being spread out through the whole universe, and then over a period of 21 days, imploding backward into yourself, so that like the first day after the experiment, he was just incomprehensibly bizarre, just universally. I mean, it was like witnessing someone acting out the Big Bang or something like that. Then the next day, he was condensed down into the local cluster, and we got a recitation somewhat like Olaf Stapleton's The Star Maker. Then the next day, and he said the lens-like shape of galaxies is a macrophysical reflection of this thing which we were trying to create, which he called the lens. And so by a series of telescoping leaps, he made his way toward normality, condensing down through the galaxy to the solar system, spending a day on each planet as he made his way toward the Earth, becoming all the life on the Earth, then becoming all human life, then becoming all Irish life, then becoming our entire family, doing perfect voice imitations of all the relatives and revealing all this knowledge of, skeletons in the closet and suppressed stuff, and stuff that I don't know how he knew all this stuff. I mean, he at times appeared to work miracles. At one point, I was trying to test him and his abilities, and I recalled that there was a box that my grandfather had given me that you opened with a little silver key that had been lost for years and years. And I said, well, if you can do anything, why don't you produce the key that to that box, which neither of us had seen even the box for a dozen years. By this time, he was naked and locked in a room at the mission. And he went and he would make these bizarre gestures, these strange, I don't know what was going on. And he went into a period of concentration, gave a wild squawk, and slammed into my hand and gave me the key. Gave me the key. He was naked. He had been locked in this room for 14 days at that time. And I was like, I didn't know what was going on. But what was happening to me was, I was like utterly unconcerned for his mental health or any practical concern, which was causing a lot of problems for the other people on the expedition. In classical psychology, this is called a folie à deux, a delusion of two. It's a simultaneous schizophrenic episode. It usually involves a mother and a daughter. I've never heard of a brother-brother folie à deux. But it was accompanied by all these exterior manifestations, freak rainbows, and in my case, an encounter with a UFO. And this UFO encounter had a very curious quality to it. Not that they don't always, I suppose. But this was even more curious than the pedestrian UFO encounter. What happened was, it was on the 13th day of the reversal, and that I had this intimation. There was something going on about the Southwest. I wasn't clear quite what it was, and the two women on the expedition were that afternoon washing our clothes down by the Chorrera, by the lake, and I looked across the lake and I saw in the sky not a rainbow but just a spot in the sky that was a spectrogrammatic diffraction, you know, a little patch of rainbow. And I asked the women if they saw it, and they said they didn't. And then it intensified. And by this time, I was plenty in the doghouse as well. I mean, this put a great deal of strain on our small party, as you can imagine. And this spectrogrammatic iridule intensified. And then I said to them, now do you see it? And they looked and they said, oh, yeah, it's, you know, big deal, not much. But I knew. And knowing means the voice was speaking to me. All kinds of weird things went on. I mean, I discovered that the closer I was to water, the easier it was for me to rhyme, which I've never... And then years later, I encountered a Celtic saying, poetry is made at the edge of running water. And the thing would give me these aphorisms. Like one time it said, the clone's load is a stoned mode. And, you know, and I was not sleeping. I was now 11 days without sleep. So that night I decided to sit by the Chorrera, and just because I stayed up all night, and I would walk in the fields, and the thing would would connect up the constellations for me and show me where they were in the sky. There was also embedded in all this thing the intimation of this thing called the teacher, which was a giant insect-like thing that was always like right over here. And there was the sense of something watching us from the sky, something moving us very, very gently but persistently toward this very weird breakthrough. So I sat there all night long on the laundry stone at the Chorrera, and about dawn, around dawn, I looked out across the lake and to the jungle, and about a mile away over the jungle there was a low bank of clouds. And as I watched these clouds, I noticed that they seemed to be rolling in place, like scrolling, like the roller on a typewriter or something. And as I watched, they divided into 4 perfectly shaped, lens-shaped cloudlets. And as I watched the 4, they coalesced into 2. And then as I kept watching, the 2 coalesced into 1. And at that moment, I heard the whee, whee, whee sound that flying saucers make in Hollywood B movies, you know? And I looked back over my shoulder, thinking of the people in the hut behind me, about 70 feet up the bank, thinking, I have to get a witness. I was driven nuts by this idea of the witness, because everybody's interpretation was that we had just gone bonkers, completely bonkers. So I thought, I have to get the witness. And I assessed the possibility and looked back across the lake, and the thing was coming toward me. It was coming straight for me. And I felt, even for me, this was some kind of a moment of truth, where then I realized, my God, it's actually real. We are going to get the lens. We are going to break through to the machinery of the millennium. And I felt my knees go out on me, and I just like sat back down, and the thing, I could see it, and getting closer and closer and clearer, and then it passed over above me, and in the last moment before it was lost by the hill of the bluff of the Chorrera, I could see it was turning slowly. It had blue and orange lights. I could see the rivets on the underside. I could see the 3 half spheres on the underside. And having spent at one point, having been interested in UFOs, I immediately recognized it as the end cap of a 1937 Hoover vacuum cleaner.